Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 4, Episode 3 of The Masked Singer. Ultimately, I apologize if you otherwise hear some background sounds going on during this review because my neighbors are seemingly like either carpenters or partiers or some other thing, and so that is probably any number of background sounds that you are hearing at this moment. Not exactly the greatest day for me today. Realizing that I had to forcibly take out certain videos, I realized that my watch time for me to get monetized had drastically dropped to the point where I am 703 hours of watch time, and I needed to have 4,000 hours of watch time. I already had both of these goals seemingly less than 30 days ago. Now, I don't have one of the two goals. So, yeah. So in other words, if you have any friends, or ultimately if you just really want to watch a lot of this content, uh, really would be great to help out this channel to share or dare say let everybody know to go in and watch this content and watch it as much as possible to get this channel remonetized. Um, so Not only that, but then let's get into the Masked Singer Season 4, Episode 3. So ultimately, we only have four characters to go into within this episode, and so reasonably, you would think odds would be better off in my favor that ultimately this time around it would just be kind of going through the motions, and ultimately you're just like, yeah, I can even narrow down even more who these people are by and large. So let's go into the choices that ultimately would otherwise tie into the people that I assumed were of these people this week. Ultimately, I'm going to let you know who had gone home by the end of this episode. You're going to actually see who ultimately was unmasked by the end of this episode. But I'm going to let you know who is the costumed name or the mascotted name that had gone home on this episode. Ultimately, we have the very much interesting like character, the Giraffe, had gone home on this episode. So reasonably within this episode, we're gonna ultimately figure out if I'd gotten this costume character correct and or not. So at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to bust out who I think the rest of these masked singers are besides Giraffe. Let's go into this. Popcorn. Ultimately, going into this episode, really a pretty decent showing of Popcorn. I think even better than last week, or last time she was on, the first episode. So, reasonably going into this, immediately there's probably going to be more guesses than there was the previous week. So ultimately, if a lot of people were thinking that I was probably cheating and this and that, no. If anything, there was reasonable times where a lot of people had commented, oh, I think it's this person, or there's a lot of times where I commented back thinking like, oh, maybe it is this person or something like that. There's always churning and burning coming down onto guesses of every single thing that I do on here. So, Popcorn this week, we are going to Taylor Dane, which ultimately a lot of people might know the song Tell It to My Heart. And ultimately, I'd made some guesses of this character on, or this singer in previous episodes. If you guys had maybe seen Michael Rosenbaum's Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, you can see a hour and change interview with Taylor Dane and know a little bit more about her. But yeah, Tell It to My Heart, that is her kind of big hit. Ultimately, we also have Tina Turner. Ultimately, reasonably, a lot of times people have kind of alluded that it might be Tina Turner. When going into this, I don't quite really know that it could be really Tina Turner anymore because reasonably, I'm thinking like, I just don't think that this show would have Tina Turner be on the show, but I could be wildly wrong. Now, going into this a little bit further, and also, Joel McHale had gone with Gloria Gaynor, which ultimately, of course, a lot of people might know the song I Will Survive that has been showcased on a lot of movies, especially if you ever seen the Keanu Reeves movie, The Replacements. That is kind of in that movie. But any kind of number of films, that song has been showcased at some point. So, reasonably, when throwing out the clue package where ultimately they had mentioned I Will Survive, ultimately you might go into Gloria and quite possibly think it could be her. Moving on. The Giraffe! The Giraffe! Yes. Ultimately, on a comment of one of my videos, ultimately someone had suggested Fred Durst, which ultimately I'm like, you know what? That actually sounds really reasonable. I'm gonna put it as a suggestion. So ultimately, yeah, Fred Durst, Travis Barker, because they wouldn't let it go. There was Travis Barker as the Giraffe. Previously, time before, I had said AJ McLean. Ultimately, because it sounded quite reasonable. If anything, within the surprising clue packages, there was an allusion to a wolf. There was also some other clues here and there. The kind of added clue that was dropped in via some drone like thing was a was a domino that said 8 on it, and immediately everybody was so centered on the number 8. They were. Uh, but yeah, that's the downfall of it all. So let's move on. Ultimately, we have some new suggestions for the Snowowls. Ultimately, this week, I am just gonna cement and lament that we're ultimately gonna go with a cluster of different kind of suggestions. Julianne and Derek Huff. Ultimately, characters who had been on Dancing with the Stars, ultimately knowing full well that they are doing some Christmas show. It ultimately could be the brother and sister combination. It seems like ultimately there had been a little snippet thing that it had been someone singing to their brother about a love song about a brother. So it could be a brother and sister combination, and instead of it being like a couple, it could just be a brother and sister. So more than likely, it might be the Huffs. You don't know. It could be interesting to ultimately um, see the Huffs being unmasked as the Snow Owls. Ultimately, I'm also thinking that it could be Vince Gill still and Amy Grant, I believe. Could honestly be them, could honestly not be. But then also, it could be the Blacks. It could be Clint Black and Lisa Hartman Black, I believe. Just a random guess in there, because reasonably, when looking at it, I'm like, you know what? It sounds like a very old sounding country like twangs. And looking at that thing, I'm like, could be them. Honestly, could be Clint Black having a little fun with the costume of which that he's presented in. at the end of the day, just throwing out a number of kitchen sink like guesses for for these characters. At the end of the day, if ultimately the Snowowls get unmasked and it is the Huffs, I think a lot of people are just like, I wish we would have kept them on later or whatever. But at the end of the day, that is all I want to say about the Snowowls. Let's move on. The Sun. The Sun. Ultimately, for this one, I think the more and more we start to see this, start to see these clues and start to see this character, I think a lot more times we are starting to see a lot more people starting to guess a lot more random-ish like things going on. The more and more we go into this, the more I think people are starting to stray away from the voice and making other choices that are just like based off of clues. When going in here, I think the very first week I'd assumed that this could be Christina Aguilera, and it could quite possibly still maybe quite possibly be Christina Aguilera. But ultimately, when looking at this, I also could assume that it could be Leanne Rimes because one of two things. I had already kind of said that it ultimately could have been Leanne Rimes at some point, just because of the sound. But I think at some point it honestly just could be Leanne Rimes. When going into this, knowing full well, I think Leanne Rimes, I think at some point was a Mickey Mouse member, and ultimately knowing that she had done Coyote Ugly at some point, and I think there was some clue this week about Ugly something. I don't remember what it was, but that's what I could possibly think could be that a little reference to Coyote Ugly, maybe. I don't know. But going into going into what else I know about Leanne Rimes at the end of the day, that's all I could really say. So, I know there could be a cluster of other people thinking a plenty number of different things. Ultimately, a lot of people that went into this episode, the judges were kind of very scatterbrained about who this all could be at the end of the day, and so reasonably they were guessing any number of people. I think a lot of times they were tying into the woods. Uh, the one judge is relenting consistently that it is Carrie Underwood, and I cannot believe that it's Carrie Underwood. Doesn't quite seemingly sound like Carrie Underwood, to be brutally honest. But at the end of the day, we could be wildly wrong. But I just don't feel that it's Carrie Underwood, and I wish the clues would relentlessly go somewhere else. So now that we've talked about every single character and who they could quite possibly be before they get unmasked, now it is time to tell you who had gotten unmasked for realsies and who had gotten eliminated and then unmasked. So, like I said, the Giraffe had gotten unmasked tonight. And so now, with an account of 10, I will, in the end, tell you who had gotten unmasked and ultimately let you know what I know about this person once unmasked. So ultimately, if you guys don't want to get spoiled about this episode, go ahead and check it out on Hulu via the next day, or ultimately go out of your way to maybe go into the YouTube channel The Masked Singer and ultimately go into this and watch any number of the performances and maybe see who had gotten revealed as well. You probably wouldn't. You'll probably catch little snippets of the show and episode and what have you. But at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to spoil who had gotten unmasked in this episode. Again, before you go, if you don't want to get spoiled, please subscribe if you're otherwise not, because definitely at the end of the day, who knows what's going to happen within the next number of days and whatever and what have you. I do these every single week once the show drops. I try to remember to do reviews on seasons and this and that. There's a cluster of other things that I do besides The Masked Singer, movie reviews, show reviews. I'm even reviewing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles currently right now at second this recording. So now, spoiler, I'm going to tell you who is the giraffe right now. Brian Austin Green. Ultimately, like I had mentioned before, everybody was looking at the number 8 from off of the domino. Here is the problem here, is that reasonably they didn't think about the word domino. So, what I know about Brian Austin Green, because I know a lot about Brian Austin Green, but I didn't realize he would be on this show. I didn't think he would be on this show. Sadly enough, so ultimately, I had gotten this one wrong. So, Brian Austin Green. Who is Brian Austin Green, if you guys don't know, if you guys aren't aware? He had been on, of course, most notably, Beverly Hills 90210, but what did the domino piece mean? Ultimately, Brian Austin Green had been in the movie Domino with Keira Knightley and Mickey Rourke, who had ultimately recently been unmasked on this episode. What a bizarre, coincidence. Also, Brian Austin Green had also been Metallo on Smallville, if you guys had caught the later seasons. Ultimately, Brian Austin Green had been notably tied to Megan Fox, being his woman, his lady. And ultimately, also, Brian Austin Green had also been in Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, which I had ultimately caught fairly recently. I have probably seen any number of different kind of Brian Austin Green shows and or movies at some point, with the exception of 90210, because I never really quite got into that. But there was a lot of other things that I did catch at the end of the day with Brian Austin Green. Yeah, so ultimately, I'm sure there's probably any number of other things that I had known about Brian Austin Green, as I consistently have to say the entire name. So, sadly enough, this is just not my day today. As well as hearing about the monetization stuff, but then kind of going to this episode going, Metallo, Sarah Connor Chronicles, okie dokie artichoke. Yeah, just so not a good day, but anyways, it is what it is. I really enjoy Brian Austin Green. Every time I see him, I'm like, yeah, that guy's great. So at the end of the day, I had gotten the giraffe incorrect. But sadly enough, well, I guess on the up and up side, if you want to have a silver lining about things, I had gotten the last 2 characters correct. So ultimately, to have one incorrect when looking at it, I was not expecting Brian Austin Green, and we're probably going to be expecting a lot of times we're going to be unexpecting certain characters to be on this show. Yeah, man. So at the end of the day, this is who the giraffe was: Brian Austin Green. Just actor, producer, and 90s icon. Reasonably, I think with Brian Austin Green, I think a lot of his stuff has kind of gotten he has been in a lot of good quality stuff, more than just 90s. So, when looking at it, I don't get the 90s icon thing, because I think he's consistently done good work. Yeah. So at the end of the day, that's all I'm going to say about Brian Austin Green. Let's go into the season review so far at the end of the day. If you don't want to know who all has been unmasked so far, by and large, you will get spoiled after this countdown. So let's go into the season review as a whole now. Right now. So ultimately, I kind of spoiled who was unmasked last week. Mickey Rourke was unmasked as the Gremlin, and the dragon, of course, was Buster Rhymes. So ultimately, 1 out of 3 is quasi not that bad right now, considering how quite possibly I could be correct on again a bulk of people. I'm still kind of expecting, like, I was just kind of expecting that that the draft could honestly be a wild card, anyways. But I could really double or triple up on certain answers of other characters and quasi at some point be correct via the coming weeks of other people. Eventually, when it is going to come down to it, I think Group C is going to be the big gigantic mystery of whether or not I will be able to get any number of those correct, because it seems Group B was very difficult to figure out who any of these people were, so Group C might be even much more difficult. But I'm assuming Group B is coming up within the following week, I'm assuming. So ultimately, more than likely, we might be losing out on somebody within that time of Group B. So ultimately, more than likely, the following week, some of the guesses will change. I will probably adjust, especially some answers for Group B, because ultimately there might be a number of people that might be thinking different answers about Group B, or ultimately I might just change my answers with certain things that I know about certain approaches about stuff. So we lost tonight, but at the end of the day, it's like it was inevitable. Like, it was inevitable to just like it just yeah, just an inevitable day. So anyways, let's otherwise just like look at a just silver lining, that hopefully everything at the end of all this will go much better. So I'm gonna call this one a wrap, and just call this a review. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.